Hello and welcome to the Bible for Worship at St. Paul Lutheran Church for this second Sunday in Lent, when our scripture reading is written in the book of Genesis, chapter 17, verses 1 through 7 and 15 to 16. When Abram was 99 years old, God appeared to Abram and said to him, "I am El Shaddai. Conduct your life in my presence and with integrity. I am setting out my covenant between myself and you. I will make very much of you." Then Abram collapsed face down, and God spoke with him. "Listen, here is my covenant with you. You will be a father of many nations. You will not be called Abram anymore. Your name will be Abraham, since I am making you a father of many nations. I will assure your power to multiply abundantly so that you become nations, and kings will come from you. I establish my covenant as an ever-present covenant between myself and you, along with your descendants after you throughout their generations, to be God for you and for your descendants after you." Then God said to Abraham, "Sarai, your wife, will not be called Sarai, but her name will be Sarah. I will bless her, even giving you a son by her. I will bless her so that she becomes nations, and kings of peoples will come from her." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Just a quick note about the translation from which I'm reading this week and will be reading for the balance of the Lenten season. Readings from the Roots is a fresh, new translation of all the lessons of the Revised Common Lectionary that we use at St. Paul. It's a translation that really strives to respect the historical context of the biblical text and to bring out for the hearer not only the beauty and the meaning of the text, but also to help the hearer hear it in the way that the original audience might have heard it. If you'd like to learn more about that, you can find it online at Readings from the Roots. That's all one word, readingsfromtheroots.bard, BARD.edu. You might find it interesting to explore that. Well, Genesis 17 and the big promise of God to Abram and Sarai regarding the whole future of their genealogical line, which is presented as the origins of the people Israel. It's curious that God's prior assurance to Abram in chapter 15 that Sarai would in fact give him a son, that God would give him a son, even in his old age, so that the servant in his house would not inherit his property. That assurance in Genesis 15 apparently was not entirely persuasive to Abram and Sarai, because in chapter 16, Sarai gives her servant Hagar to Abram in order for them to produce a child so that Abram's line will continue. Sarai proposes it. Abram goes along with it. Hagar probably doesn't have much choice and goes along with it. And so Ishmael is born. And after that, God comes to Abram again, at least as the narrative tells it. And in this scene, there is truly a transformation of Abram and Sarai as God makes this promise, and with it changes their names. You can imagine what a transformation it is to change your name. It has happened in our Western culture probably most often in marriage, when women have had their names changed in order to take on the family name of their husbands. But others have also changed their names from time to time. And typically it does represent some kind of transformation that is underway, whether through marriage or perhaps through adoption, or perhaps through the intentional choice to take up a new life and a new identity for whatever reason. Well, the Bible records a number of these occasions when God changes the name of an individual within Israel's history, but also we know that Jesus called a man named Simon and then told him that his name would be Peter, the rock, and that there was a Jew by the name of Saul who was persecuting the church, who came to be known as Paul, the great apostle to the Gentiles. So this promise with an accompanying name change is transformational to Abram and Sarai. Their name change in some ways actually embodies the change, as the text tells us that God said, "You will not be Avram, Abram, but Avraham, because I have made you the father of a multitude," Hamon. So from Avram, which some would understand to be the exalted father or the great father, to Avraham, Avraham, God, father of a multitude. And what a multitude it does become. Of course, Sarah also is renamed, perhaps from something like my lords or my gods, or we're not exactly sure what Sarai might have meant. The biblical author doesn't give us an indication. But as Sarah, she becomes the princess, the queen, the part of the royal court that produces this multitude of nations and from whom kings will come. A promise of many nations. And indeed, that promise ends up being fulfilled in the 12 tribes of Israel, but also in Ishmael and in Esau. And if we pay close attention to chapter 25 of Genesis at its beginning, we find that after Sarah died, Abraham went on to become the father of even more nations with a new wife, Keturah, who bore him 6 sons, and we might assume a number of daughters as well. That Abraham would become a father and Sarah would become a mother of many nations. This one figure of Abraham and Sarah, this couple, becomes thus the symbolic starting point of all of the 12 tribes that made up the people Israel in that land of Canaan. Now, interestingly, Genesis 17 in verse 8 also says that God promises to give the land of Canaan to Abraham and Sarah and their descendants after them for a perpetual holding. We don't read that promise in our lectionary, and honestly, that's a bit troubling. But we also don't read verses 9 through 14, which talk about the very particularity of the sign of the covenant that God is now making, which is the sign of circumcision, literally carved into the body of Abraham and Ishmael and Isaac and Jewish men ever since. It's troubling that we don't read these verses because we lose something in them. As difficult as it is, as challenging as it is, as complicated as it is to work out the notion of God giving this land of Canaan to Abraham and Sarah and their descendants as a perpetual holding, to make sense of that and to somehow respect and apply that in our era of nation states and geopolitical conflict. As difficult as that is, simply dropping the particularity of the gift of this land of Canaan where you are standing, God says, and the particularity of this sign of the covenant that is carved into your body, to lose that particularity from this promise risks losing the truth about God, which we know and to which it testifies, that God does not sit remotely and somehow cast generic blessing out into the universe. God comes and makes promises and gives blessings in very specific, particular ways. That may complicate our lives, but that is also what sustains and blesses and enriches, in some ways guarantees our lives. That God is particular in relating with us, with Israel as a people, with us through Christ as the church, with all of God's creation in all of its diversity, and particularly. And that's the other transformation. That's the other symbol in these name changes. Jewish tradition for a long time has noticed that the change that actually happens in the names is the addition of the letter H. Avram, Avraham. Sarai, Sarah, with an H at the end. That letter H in Hebrew stands for the divine name, the personal name of God, that four-letter name of God that is not pronounced because it is so holy. And the promise that transforms Abram and Sarai into Abraham and Sarah could be understood to be that God promises, as the text says, to be God to you and to your descendants. That H, that is God, gets planted right in their names so that everywhere they go, God is with them. That too is the promise, theirs and ours. God bless.